So we're good to go. Just move the slides. Hello, everyone. So let me start properly this time around. We had some small issues. It's probably the first time. I don't think it's not gonna be the last time. So Zoom was playing some games with us today. Thank you all for coming. So welcome to the monthly edition of UCL AI Insights. I'm your host, Adriano Koshiyama, Research Fellow here at the UCL Computer Science Department. With the drive towards automation and digital transformation, accelerated more and more by COVID-19, research development and deployment of AI systems continue to increase. I think the adoption of AI in the judicial system across various sectors of law more broadly has the potential to both revolutionize the practice of law and rework our notions of due process and justice. This UCL AI Insights event will explore the evolving interplay between AI and the judicial system. So in this webinar, we welcome Dr. Pamela Ugudik from the University of Southampton and the Alan Turing Institute, and Charles Kerrigan is a CMS partner and global head of FinTech to present the perspectives from academia and industry. They will cover how decision-making in the legal system, how cases get to court, how courts take decisions, the automation in the legal systems, and much more. I'll just do a quick bio reading before we start. I'll first start with Dr. Pamela. Dr. Pamela Ugudik is Associate Professor of Criminology at the University of Southampton and a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. She's leading multidisciplinary research projects that are exploring AI ethics and governance, with focus on the data-driven algorithms that inform decision-making and judicial and justice systems. Dr. Ugudik sits on a number of advisory boards, such as the advisory group for the Ada Lovelace Institute's legal review of the governance of biometric data in the UK. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you.
My second guest is Charles Kerrigan. Charles Kerrigan is. In the meantime, please feel free to ask any questions in the chat or the Q&A function that you have. Feel free also to ask questions through the YouTube channel if you prefer. The floor is yours, Charles.
Thanks, Adriano. And I'm pleased to be here because today I want to make a few comments about the commercial application of AI in the judicial system. So when I'm thinking of the judicial system, I'm thinking of commercial courts. So I'm not looking at the criminal justice system, I'm looking at commercial cases. And I'm going to make a few points around that and try and cover through the initial conversation how practicing lawyers and the courts are both looking at developments in technology. So I'd make a few points to start, which is the courts are enthusiastic about technology, and in particular, the ability for technology to improve efficiencies and to reduce costs. The way that we see that most prominently over the last few years has been through something called technology-assisted review. And TAR is something which is now familiar to litigators and familiar to judges. And the reason that technology-assisted review is significant is that one of the most problematic aspects of commercial litigation in the UK and in fact anywhere at the moment is the volume of paperwork that's involved in that. So one of the founding principles of litigation is that both parties should have access to all information, that there is a requirement on parties coming to litigation processes that they're prepared to share all of their information and disclose both the good and bad parts of their case. Now, that leads in large commercial disputes to enormous volumes of information being made available, and therefore the clear benefit of technology is enabling the courts and parties to court processes to be able to work with those volumes of documentation. And so we have very obvious use cases for artificial intelligence tools in that context. The ability to identify categorize, sort, and surface issues is something that the systems have been trained on now for a few years and are pretty good at. So we have good levels of success in using what are now commercially available AI tools to help manage the documentation in a court process. So we can talk more about court processes in the conversation, the Q&A, but I also want to work back from the courts and identify how we should be thinking about artificial intelligence technology and technology generally in the stages that precede a visit to court. So by definition, if there is a piece of commercial litigation, I think we can safely assume that something has gone wrong. There are at least two parties that have a disagreement that they haven't been able to resolve through negotiation. So if we work back then from the court process, we can see that there would be a process of negotiation which has failed. If we work back from that process of negotiation, we can see that there would be an underlying transaction, usually. So it's often in commercial litigation contracts that are at issue and the dispute relates to those. So we've probably got a transaction, a contractual transaction, which precedes it. And then preceding even that is a relationship between the parties that has ultimately failed, but of course would have started in a much more positive sense. So I just track back through those. The negotiation part, we're starting to see the benefit of technology in helping parties identify where they should reach a settlement in relation to a dispute. So previously, one of the judgment questions for lawyers who are involved in litigation is to say to the parties, your case is strong in these areas, weak in these areas, and overall, we can make a judgment that you are likely to win these points, lose these points. This would be the ultimate view of the courts. You can't directly put a number on that, but you can say that the risk of losing is a certain percentage, the risk of winning is a certain percentage. You can apply that to the claim. So you can apply some mathematics to that, but previously, it's only been on the case of the context of the judgment of lawyers with experience in that area. That won't change. I think we'll always have some human judgment in it. But what technology is starting to do is enable the practicing litigators to run simulations of the issues in the trial, look at previous cases where similar issues have been tried, look at situations that the court could take into consideration in reaching a verdict. And we don't see this so much in the UK, but certainly in the US, also make some judgments about the judge. Is the judge someone who is has a reputation for favouring certain types of parties in commercial litigation? So we're at the very early stages of that step back and saying, what is a piece of litigation worth? If you're making a claim in litigation as a claimant for 100, so if you are successful on all points, you win 100 in damages. If you are successful in half the points, maybe you could assume that you'd win 50 in damages. So it's the ability to run those technology products, and they are very early stage prototypes that we're talking about here, to avoid the trip to court. The courts, the judges, would rather that people stay out of the courts. It is more efficient for commercial parties to resolve their disputes without visiting court. And so we work back again. I touched on the preceding point being the contract. There is a contract which is now in existence, we're assuming, between the parties. So a long form natural language contract which has been negotiated in detail. We're beginning to use technology to look over and support the negotiation of those contracts and try and again avoid litigation and disputes. what types of contractual terms are most often litigated? Why are they litigated? How can that be avoided? So we're using the technology, looking back from the visit to court that we're trying to avoid, to support the negotiation, support the production of the contract, and ensure that the parties are less likely to have a dispute. You can never guarantee that there won't be a dispute between commercial parties, but you can try and identify the points where there's an increased likelihood of a dispute arising. So we have technology that looks at contracts in that term as well. It supports negotiation and it supports the parties in trying to ensure that where they are in areas that are most often litigated, the parties are more thoughtful about that and take into account the nature of litigation. And I'm going to roll back one stage further and say that part of the early stage of relationships that turn into these commercial contracts and then potentially commercial disputes is to refine the arrangement. So often in the early stage of negotiation, parties are very good at identifying what they agree on. So they can pull out the points and say, we want to do this deal, and we agree that it would be a good deal for both parties if it had these characteristics. The natural human inclination is to be optimistic about those transactions. And so parties focus on two things in particular. One is they make an assumption that the deal would be successful, because if you assume it won't be successful, you would walk away. You would never sign that sort of transaction. And the second is you focus on the points that are positives. You focus on the parts where both parties are making money. You focus less on the parts where there's a dispute, there's a disagreement. So we're using technology in that sense to try and bring in some design thinking and ensure that when the parties are in the early stages of a commercial transaction, we're bringing design thinking and technology to say, what are the bits that we're missing? What are the known unknowns? What are the unknown unknowns? And try and use AI and other technology products to surface those so that if the deal is fated to lead to a disagreement, we've got more tools that can identify that up front. And we can try and take steps to avoid that, shape the deal a certain way. I'm giving brief overview of things here. There are just two other things that I wanted to reference in this first part of the presentation. One is smart contracts, and whilst they have been in use for a number of years, and Bitcoin is the classic example of self-executing transactions, smart contracts are now becoming much more prevalent and common in commercial arrangements between parties. So the benefit of that is efficiency, that we can have contracts coded and they can be executed and enforced without human intervention, but they pose a challenge for the courts. The question of whether computer code is self-executing is a slightly different question to the question of whether computer code counts as a contract for the requirements of a contract under English law to be enforceable. It could be taken to the court. So that's a separate point to where I started. I was making the assumption in the earlier points that we're dealing with a long form negotiated natural language contract, and we're using technology to improve how the parties engage with that process and avoid litigation. Secondly, we're trying to be aware of the same kinds of issues in smart contracts. Smart contracts are, I think, a tremendous benefit, will be used far more in commercial transactions over the next few years, but they raise different issues to those that we're wrestling with in the case of conventional contracts. And the final point that I'd make is we're trying to use technology to log those things that are connected to disputes. So sometimes disputes have an aspect of fault of one of the parties involved, but often they are caused by neutral events, no fault in either party. So that may be caused by a change of circumstances, a mistake, a change of understanding, some assumptions that parties are making that don't align. And one of the things that we're trying to do with technology is search through the disputes that we can see and identify what it is that's giving rise to them. In the case of a mistake, why a party's mistaken, what gives rise to a mistake, and see if we can use the data that we get from that type of analysis to surface and identify, in the context of a particular negotiation, is there a risk that those characteristics that we've seen give rise to disputes in other contexts could give rise to a dispute here, and focus more on that. So the benefits of technology in relation to litigation, the judicial system generally, I think start from a point of efficiency, cost saving, similar, reaching outcomes more quickly, taking pressure off the courts and enabling parties to be more autonomous in resolving disputes. But as a second order, the work that's being done there should also, by implication, put us in a position where parties are doing better transactions, deals that would fail are not being entered into, deals that are entered into have got better design, they just work better, they're more robust, the parties have got a better understanding. And then finally, smart contracts kind of change everything, and we'll have to get our heads around those too. So that was my perspective on where we are. I'm not a litigator. I try and avoid going to court. But the relevance of this for me, the judicial system and technology, is that we can do better transactions for the parties involved, and avoiding a trip to court means that there is a better underlying commercial arrangement that is more economically productive, more economically efficient.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles, for that. Charles, could you make me a host again? Because again, Zoom is blocking my camera from turning on. So it's an interesting day for
you should be back.
Thank you, Charles. Let me just turn it on.
Okay.
I'll make Pamela host as well so she can turn on her camera. Just a moment. And Pamela, let me just try now. Maybe not the best thing now is not to turn off your camera, because we end up having to do this loop all over again. There's plenty of questions, and I have my own questions as well, Charles. And I think there is I'm looking from a very layman position, and every time that because when we think about justice system, generally speaking, and the application of AI, we tend to think about judge decisions most cases. I think it's just maybe there's a kind of television aspects to it, and that's what we're kind of all the time thinking. But I know there was a lot of applications about what you mentioned, Charles, about trying to look at clauses and computing the likelihood of that clause creating an issue in the contract, and then you can hopefully create a contract where the likelihood of any breach is very, very low. Of course, not perfect, but you could try to cook something like that using machine learning in some other technologies. Before I go to a lot of questions on the Q&A, I'm just interested in your view, Charles, about, and I think that would be the question from Professor Treleaven, if he was here, about the aspect of smart contracts and the idea that codes that is basically underpinning the smart contract itself. I don't know if it's not going to be able to be brought to court, but at the moment it feels like there's a massive void, and it's one of those areas where there's there's a kind of a feeling of disruption happening, and the necessity to fill that vacuum with at least some structure. What's your thoughts about it? What is the direction you're seeing it going at the moment?
There are lots of points there. I'll try and take two to illustrate the type of points. So I think the first one I'd say is the logic of smart contracts can do away with judicial decision making. So try not to use Bitcoin too often as an example for smart contracts, because it's quite a charged example, but it's the best example of the decentralized nature of Bitcoin. Means that there is no there's no gap for a judge to get into. So in other words, all Bitcoin is about is the transfer of value. Transfer of value takes place more or less in real time. And once that has taken place, there isn't an underlying contract to it. So if you apply that to smart contracts, the contracts are self-executing. That implies that they are self-enforcing. So the contract has coded into it how the relationship between the parties should evolve at the time that it's entered into. If you don't have some human-in-the-loop aspect to it, so a pure smart contract will just continue to operate in accordance with the terms of the code. And that means that if a party is due to make a payment or due to receive a payment, that payment will be made under the code. You don't need a judge to enforce the obligation of the party to make it. So the key feature of smart contracts in this context is that they have their own built-in enforcement. The obligations are self-executing. So I think that is a big question for the design of transactions, because whilst it seems like a positive, and I think it's easily done in the case of transfers of value, something like a cryptocurrency, value is transferred in exchange for value being provided on the other side of the transaction. But it doesn't work as well for more complex transactions, and most commercial transactions are more complex. The second point that I make, which I am going to say out loud, although I'm a practicing lawyer, I think sometimes natural language enables transactions to complete because of its vagueness. So contracts in the commercial sphere often make reference to reasonableness, materiality, those sort of tests. Now, if I gave my contract to you, you would just hand it back to me with this clause saying, define materiality. How are we testing it? When are we testing it? Why are we testing it? So I think we're aware of it as lawyers, and we would probably say, most practicing lawyers would probably say that is the bargain between the parties, which we're simply reflecting in the contracts. I think because of my background in smart contracts and conversations with you and Emre and others in the sphere, I think that you could also look at it as that type of language is a bit of a hack in order to get a transaction done. So it's impractical for the parties to a large transaction to go into a granular level on how they would define materiality in every potentially foreseeable situation. So I think lawyers are actually cutting through some of the hard questions to help parties reach a conclusion. I think the aim of a contract that describes every possibility is undermined by the fact that in the commercial sphere, people just need to go for a good enough solution, an efficient solution, get the contract signed and move on with the relationship.
Let me do a fireside with you, Charles, because a lot of questions piling up now. One is the question from Julian. She was asking about the bugs in the code of smart contracts. That's an open question. Is it a bug or was it was a feature?
Yes, so exactly, and famously, we've had cases with Ethereum and the fork on Ethereum. When we define smart contracts in practice, we categorize them by reference to how much code there is. So we can have a natural language contract that is turned into a smart contract. At the other end of the spectrum, we can have a purely smart contract with no natural language related to it. More commonly, we're somewhere in the middle of those two. So it may be, and the most conventional is to have a natural language contract with some parts that are coded. And those parts are the decision tree type parts, if this, then that. So those naturally work well with payment obligations. You could see if it's Thursday and the stock market is above a certain level, X pays Y amount to Z. And that can be coded naturally, and it can live in a natural language environment that says, you know, what happens in other situations that can bring in the concepts of materiality and reasonableness. But commercial parties, by and large, are still very nervous outside cryptocurrencies of having a pure self-executing smart contract. There's just too much uncertainty in the world for people to be comfortable with them and practice just yet. But we're working on it. It is evolving.
Absolutely. I just want to now open the floor to Pamela, and there is plenty of questions, but these questions I think has to be put to you both, which was questions about the role of the judges and the data going forward. But I'll leave those questions to the end so we can fill both of them. So I think I've made Pamela now the host. I think she now has the full power to share her screen, and yeah, I'll just open the floor to you, Pamela, for your considerations.
Right. Thank you, Adriano. Is it okay if I share some PowerPoint slides, please?
Absolutely.
So can you see the slides?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I can see it now. Great. Okay. Well, so in my presentation, I'm going to talk about the data-driven predictive algorithms that are being used to make potentially life-changing decisions in the justice system. And I will show that, you know, although the algorithms are depicted as race neutral, there are several implications of assuming that they are. So one implication is that, you know, this assumption that they are race neutral can sort of mask several structural conditions that make the algorithms quite capable of generating racially biased predictions. So I believe that, you know, the structural conditions I've just mentioned have not received as much attention as they should. And so in my presentation, because I only have, I think it's 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to provide only one key example of such conditions. And the example I'll focus on is the power of discretion that is available to the people who create the algorithms. Now, with their discretionary powers, the creators or developers of the algorithms can make decisions that can introduce bias into algorithmic decision making. But then, you know, one implication of assuming of this assumption that the algorithms are race neutral is that it is an assumption that ignores this problem of biased algorithmic decision making. So in my conclusion, I'll mention a few possible solutions to the problem of, you know, racially biased predictions in the justice system. So the predictive algorithms I'm going to talk about today, I'll just move on to the next slide. I think I've missed my slide. Beg your pardon. So the predictive algorithms I'll talk about today, they're being used to make decisions that can have profound implications for the freedom and well-being of individuals and communities. So for example, some police services use them. They've used them to make bail decisions or to forecast crime risk locations. The courts also use them to make sentencing decisions. They're also used in the penal system by, for example, prison and probation services to make decisions about the type or the level of intervention that is required in each case. Now, they're also sometimes where they're used to determine parole eligibility. So in all these contexts, a higher risk score is more likely to attract a more punitive outcome than a lower risk score. So this is sort of a risk-focused approach to making criminal justice decisions, and it has a long and well-documented history. And on this screen, I've provided some references for those who are interested in exploring the history and evolution of risk-focused criminal justice. So as I said, the predictive algorithms I'm talking about, they're used to make decisions in the justice system. They're used to predict crime risks or the risks of recidivism. And they are ostensibly race neutral. They appear to be race neutral. But as I said, there are structural conditions that make them quite capable of generating racially biased predictions. And I said that, one such condition is the power of discretion that is available to those who create the algorithms. Now, discretionary decision-making can inject bias into the design of apparently race-neutral algorithms through what I describe as 3 potential conduits of bias. Now, the first conduit of bias is, I'll move on to the correct slide. I think I've got the wrong slide. So the first conduit of bias is the set of data that the creators select when they design the algorithms. The second conduit of bias is the range of risk predictors or risk factors that the creators also select. And the third is the set of variables that the creators define as indicators of recidivism. Now, these conduits of bias stem from discretionary decisions or the discretionary decisions of those who create or design the algorithms. But of course, an implication of the race neutrality logic is that it masks or ignores these decision-making processes that can inject bias into predictive algorithms. So I'm now going to talk about the first conduit of bias I just mentioned, which is the set of data that the algorithms actually rely on for predictions. So how does data selection inject bias into algorithmic predictions? Now this happens because the data sets that are typically chosen by the creators of the algorithms are usually administrative data sets that criminal justice officials generate from people who are involved in the justice system. So such data usually comprises arrest data, reconviction data, and so on. So if data sets like arrest data, for example, are used to program or train algorithms to make predictions, then people who are arrested at a higher rate than others will become vulnerable or more vulnerable to higher risk scores than they deserve. Now, official statistics and several studies across many jurisdictions where predictive algorithms are used, like the United Kingdom, the United States, Australia, and Canada, consistently show that Black people are arrested at a higher rate than others. And so they will be more disadvantaged if or when arrest data are used to predict risks of reoffending. So, just to summarize what I've been saying, the set of data that the creators of these algorithms select when they design the algorithms can operate as a conduit of bias. It can infuse bias into algorithms that appear to be race neutral. So this quotation that you can see on the screen is from a report that was published. Sorry, I've lost the screen I was sharing. Sorry, beg your pardon.
No worries. Yep.
I'll see if I can share it again. Can you see the screen? I beg your pardon, sorry.
Yeah, we can, but
oh, you can now, sorry. So the quotation that you can see on this screen is from a report that was published in MIT Technology Review. So the report sort of summarized the findings of a study that was conducted by the authors of the report. Now the study sort of explored how an algorithm that is used in some parts of the United States to predict risks of reoffending uses police arrest data to make predictions. And the authors of that report were able to demonstrate that it is difficult, if not practically impossible, for algorithms that rely on such data to generate unbiased predictions. So the quotation on the screen is from the report and sort of summarizes the point I've been making about the link between potentially biased administrative data and biased predictions. So, you know, the author said, predictions reflect the data used to make them. If Black defendants are arrested at a higher rate than white defendants in the real world, they will have a higher rate of predictive arrest as well. So this means that it will also have higher risk scores on average, and a larger percentage of them will be labeled as high risk. So I want to provide additional examples. I don't know how much time I have for this, but I want to provide at least one or two examples of studies that also show that the data that apparently race-neutral algorithms use to predict risk can trigger biased predictions. So for example, a study that was conducted, that was published in 2016, found that an algorithm that is applied in some parts of the United States was generating higher rates of false positives for Black defendants than others. Now, what this means is that the algorithm was artificially inflating risks in cases involving Black people. It was over-predicting their risks, and this had nothing to do with the previous crimes they had committed or the types of crimes for which they had been arrested. So what was making an apparently race-neutral algorithm overpredict risk in cases involving Black defendants? Now, one factor could have been the data that the algorithm was using to make predictions. So for example, it seems like it was relying on criminal history data like police arrest records and so forth. And as I've said, official statistics in the US where the algorithm was being used consistently show that Black people are more likely to be arrested than others, and that racial bias could be a contributory factor. But because Black people are more likely to be arrested than others, that if arrest history is used to predict risks of reoffending, it could operate as a proxy for race. It could be similar to simply relying on race as a risk predictor. And of course, this can make Black people more vulnerable to false positives in the form of higher risk scores than they deserve. So I want to talk quickly about a study that I'm currently leading, which is exploring how a predictive policing algorithm uses data to predict future crime locations. So the main aim of the study is to understand how data can operate as a conduit of bias and what can be done to address the problem. Now, this study is funded by the Alan Turing Institute. It is a multidisciplinary project. So we have researchers from criminology, data science, and software engineering working on the study. So for the project, we've built a computational module that replicates a predictive policing algorithm that has been used by some police services in the US and here in the UK to identify future crime locations. Now, with the replica, what we've done is we've run large-scale tests of synthetic crime data to see how the algorithm makes its predictions. And one of the things we found is that the algorithm has self-reinforcing properties in the sense that once it detects an increase in crime in a particular area, it continues to predict more crimes in that area, even after the background crime rate in the area stabilizes and returns to normal. So this finding, our finding actually reinforces the findings of other studies that also show that when some predictive policing algorithms rely on police data to predict future crime locations, the areas or locations that are historically overrepresented in police data can end up being constantly predicted as high-risk areas. And this can sort of reinforce the problem of over-policing and excessive police intervention in those areas. Now, I suppose it's important to note at this point that there is no reason to believe that the creators of these predictive algorithms have negative intentions at heart when they create or design the tools. What I'm trying to show in this presentation is that certain factors can actually introduce bias, and it's important to identify the factors and consider how to address the problem.
Can I just make an intervention, Pamela, quickly?
Yeah.
And I apologize for that because we are receiving a lot of questions.
Right.
I would like just to put forward some questions to you that we are getting.
Okay.
Yeah, could you maybe stop sharing your screen so we just go back to the.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. And I found the questions that we're receiving, which is kind of goes back to your first study, and people are. I've received 2 emails about it right now. That's why I'm trying to press forward with some questions. Is that what is the role of the judicial system in that first example? Was there because we identified the mistake in the first place. That's true. But what is the internal rearrangement of the whole justice system on trying to address the issue that emerged? Because when these problems emerge, it feels that it kind of they try to scapegoat in someone, in a developer or in a company, and there is no self assessment of what has actually taken place.
Yeah, I think my understanding of your question is, what can be done to address this problem of, address the potential for ostensibly race-neutral algorithms to produce racially biased outcomes, or what can be done to at least mitigate some of the problems. As far as I know, there's currently no consensus in the academic literature on how to solve the problem, so I can't sort of profess solutions. My aim here today really was to talk about some of the key issues that should be taken into account when we consider how to solve the problem or how to mitigate the problem of, algorithmic biases. But I suppose I've given a lot of thought to that. And I suppose, one of the things that can help mitigate the problem is to democratize the processes of creating the algorithms. And, this is being actually piloted in some parts of the United States with quite a lot of success. So it involves allowing the communities whose lives are often negatively affected by the algorithms to sort of have a say in some of the choices and decisions that go into creating the algorithms, like choosing the data sets, choosing the predictors, and so forth. There should also be an effort to encourage some form of public engagement. And I think this democratization that I'm proposing should be part of that. It's been trialed in the States, like I said, and then audits as well. Audits, impact assessments, can help attenuate algorithmic biases. So before an algorithm is used in the justice system, audits and impact assessments should be conducted to try and understand how the algorithm would affect the lives of diverse groups. There's several other examples. But
just I think there is a general curiosity, and I'm noticing in the questions, is that why this debate is more centered in examples that is coming from the US,
yes,
so much from the other countries around the globe. Is it just because there the technology is more developed, or there's more openness to try these new approaches there?
I think one of the things I've noticed, certainly with my Turing project, is access to data to study these things. I think there's better access in the United States. That I can't be 100% sure, but we struggled. Our project team, we struggled to actually gain access to these to the data sets that we need to see what is going on, to try and understand what is going on. But also the algorithms, as you know, are trade secrets. So gaining access to them is another problem. I mean, we were only able to do our project because one of the creators actually published their algorithm, To me, that's a sign of good faith, but access to data, access to the algorithms themselves, those are, I think, major setbacks in the effort to try and understand how to mitigate or avoid biases.
There's a question from Julian. He's asking about the, which I noticed that he, not she, because I also apologize for that before, he's asking about the other source of bias beyond the data that you also mentioned. Could you also elaborate a little bit more on those?
Yes, I was going to say that before you asked the questions. I was going to talk more about them. So, there are several other conduits of bias. I mean, I was talking about the selection of predictors that, the creators of the algorithms, they have the discretion to select algorithms, to select the predictors. And again, one of the predictors that is commonly used is criminal history. So, using arrest data again can sort of generate bias predictions. The third one I was going to talk about was how recidivism itself is defined. Again, the creators of the algorithms have the discretion, so I'm emphasizing the fact that discretionary decision-making is a structural condition that can inject bias into the system. So the people who create the algorithms, they have the power to define recidivism, what it means. And again, often the definition of recidivism is arrest, taking us back to the issue of, the people who tend to be arrested the more would become more likely then to have a higher risk scores and so on if we use recidivism as the outcome variable, or the predictor variable, basically.
Perfect. Yeah. One of the questions which I think goes to you and goes to Charles as well. It's a question that I usually joke with we have a friend who is a judge, and we keep saying that we are in the computer science department trying to find a way to disrupt the judge. So we try to replace the judge for an algorithm and take their jobs, but I don't think that's actually going to take place anytime soon. But what is the if that would be the case? Let's maybe just confabulate a little bit more about it. That replacing a judge by an algorithm. What would be the benefits, let's say, on the criminal point of view, or maybe the cons as well, not only the pros but also the cons, in your view?
Of replacing the judge with an algorithm.
Yeah.
You're asking what would be the benefits of that?
Yeah. What do you see the benefits, or even the non-benefits, the cons, the pros and cons?
Well, given that the algorithms that we're dealing with currently in the justice system are not regulated by law, I think it could become problematic, if we have the same data-related problems I just mentioned, selecting what the risk predictors are, how we define recidivism, and so on. If that is left up to the discretion of a few people who create these algorithms, then I think the same problems will remain if we remove the judge, from the decision-making loop. And even if we leave the judge in the decision-making loop, we still have the problems, I can't think of any added benefits given the way the algorithms currently are.
Yeah, very interesting.
I would maybe say from my side,
I think your camera is frozen. I think you're frozen.
Oh,
no. When you're
there. I look okay.
Yeah, can you make Charles the host, Pamela, so he can reactivate?
Right.
We are now. So I'll talk while we sort that out. So I would say that the one of the answers is that the judges will have access to algorithms and technology, and there will be a more open sharing of some of that, and that will be something that would be regulated, so that to avoid some of the questions around having an ability to game the system, I think one of the solutions for that would be for some of the technology to be open source, and therefore it can be tested and apparent. I also think that one of the interesting contrasts between what Pamela sees and what I see is there's more public data in the criminal justice system, because in commercial transactions, obviously we have private contracts, but then conversely, the commercial system is better funded than the criminal justice system. So we kind of got less data and more money on one side, and more data and less money on the other side. And I think it would be helpful to find some policy methods that can bring those two together so that we each benefit from the other. But I think, and I was tapping away answers to some of the questions, algorithmic auditing, which obviously you and Emre are expert in, and transparency and ethical design. So all of the work that I look in AI, we start with ethics before the project is scoped out, and ethics is considered at every part of a project of this type. So the GDPR has made people very sensitive to data, and I think it's therefore a good springboard for people to understand that ethics is key to everything in the use of AI and technology more generally.
Yeah, excellent. In the meantime, I'm just trying to show the camera for Charles, but I have another question, which is the question about the. I think that maybe we can make the slides available, and I'll ask Dr. Pamela if she can make some of those slides available for the audience. So some people asking for it. I'll ask her by email. I think one of the questions that keeps popping up is the question about the data, and I kind of understand why people are so fascinated about the data, and maybe just because it's a very material element to everything. Like we are part of the data, we create data, and the data is basically a representation, a lot of the case, of ourselves and of our actions. But in some situations, it feels like, and that's the main point of those people, that we don't have enough data. The data sets are quite small. Or I remember discussing this with Pamela about the bias in the data sets, and there is no, in fact, bias in the data set. The data is what it is. So if that's the case, and we cannot do much about the data in itself, what is the role for having, let's say, a human in the loop, or combination of, let's say, the traditional system of justice and the combination and the empowerment for algorithms? Is that a possibility forward in the meantime, where in some situations we don't have enough data points, etc.? Maybe go back to the rule-based systems and not try to go forward with machine learning or anything like that. Is that a possibility to at least kickstart the development in some space?
Is that a question to me?
Yeah, maybe you could go first.
Yes, I mean, I know there are many studies out there from within the computer science scholarship and computer science and data science scholarships looking at debiasing data sets to improve the fairness of predictive algorithms. I don't know how successful that has been, but I know that efforts are being made to look at how to actually remove the biases that some of the biases I've just mentioned. But I suppose the thing to bear in mind actually is that the predictive algorithms that are used in the justice system, as far as I know, there's always a human in the loop. So it's not all data-based decision-making. It's not all automated. There's always either a probation officer contributing to the decision-making process, or a judge, or a police officer, and so on and so forth, as far as I know. So the issue of having the human in the loop is not really a problem within the justice system. I think the main problem is the data sets, like I said earlier, and there is a lot of effort being made to try and look at how to debias data sets. But then, that brings me to the issue that we discussed, Adriano, some time ago, about the fact that, the data, criminal justice data, is actually the reality, reflects the reality of what is happening in the real world. And, what algorithms do is to just reflect back that reality to us. So if we debias data sets, then what we're creating is just artificial data that has no bearing on what the situation is in the real world. So, those are the comments I can offer on that. But there is a lot of work being done in the area.
Yeah, amazing. It's almost
I just add, sorry, go on, Adriana. I'm just going to add a very quick point for me that if you go into the FCA, the financial regulators sandbox, one of the benefits that you get is they will share training data with you. And some of that is real data, some of it is synthetic data. So I think this is, there's certainly no easy answer to those questions. But if you're a company that's innovating in that area, then there are opportunities to get data from the regulator that has been approved in the broadest sense, so it's sort of cleaned and made accessible and available.
Oh, excellent. I think
I should also add very quickly, Adriano, I should also add, I think the Ministry of Justice is also looking into making quite a lot of data available, linked data from a range of other services available to researchers and others. So there's that level of transparency being introduced. So I think that's a good step forward.
Yeah, it feels like the sandbox approach, let's call it this way, it could be a way forward to kind of kickstart the discussion. But I like your final point, Pamela, which is like if you end up debiasing the data sets or creating a synthetic version of it, it's like almost like I'm not going to say utopic version, but it's almost like Orwellian, like you're trying to rewrite the whole history and not try to face the crudeness of what it is. I've amazing discussion. I need to close now, but I'd like to thank Pamela and Charles for the fruitful participation, insights provided. Special thanks for Emery for the coordination and content curation. Thanks for the UCL AI Center, Computer Science Department, Faculty of Engineering, Innovation Enterprise for sponsoring our activities. Please subscribe to the UCL AI Center YouTube channel, Twitter page. Follow the UCL AI Insights LinkedIn webpage. By the way, in 2 months' time, we'll be hosting our DAlgo conference. We have Pamela hosting a session there. We're going to have Charles and many others. Keep tuned for more updates. Next month, we're going to have the full advert out, but probably by next week already the advert is going to be out, but next month on the UCL AI Insights. See you next month, where we discuss the building unicorns, AI, and enterprise. Goodbye and see you all soon.